Hi, SEA. This is Jared. I'd like to talk to you today about some FERPA information. I want to start off by directly bringing to your attention the idea of how much information surrounds FERPA, how much legal there is, how much laws, criteria, gray areas. There's so much information that there's no way I could possibly cover everything. But today's presentation is going to focus on what FERPA is, how it affects the people around us, and how it affects us in our classrooms and us as teachers in this profession. So let's go ahead and get started with looking at what is FERPA. FERPA stands for the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and FERPA is a federal law that protects the confidentiality of student records. I'd like to really highlight on the fact that it says student records. Other words that you can use for this is educational log, educational file, educational records. A lot of FERPA really focuses on that documentation piece, that physical document that lists that student's information, and that's really what FERPA is trying to keep that information on those documents from getting into public hands. How does FERPA protect? So the law provides the right to receive a copy of student records. So this can be from student, this can be parents of student if they're under the age of 18. The right to deny public access to educational records. So that's the fact that FERPA is going to protect, or schools are going to protect, that student's information on their educational log or their educational record from being released to third parties or released to the public. The next is the process to make amendments and steps that include a hearing. So for example, if a student needs to make an amendment, and it's not able to easily be changed, they are able to schedule a hearing in which courts will look at what needs changed and how to do so. The next is the right to opt out of data collection services. This is vendors. In today's society, we see a lot of online vendors, as well as recruitment. It talks a little bit about military recruitment and how your students' data is stored at the school. Our government, because of No Child Left Behind Act, is able to incorporate our military into our school and the recruiters into our school to help, I guess you could say, broaden more choices for after high school. But in doing so, it kind of made things convoluted for that information. So the recruitment piece is something that your students can opt out of, but it's information that FERPA protects. The next is the compliant process, and it's handled by the Family Compliance Office of the U.S. Department of Education. So what constitutes as educational record? What exactly are educational records? So it focuses on the student's name and address, and that of their family members, their parents, and so forth. There's personal identifiers such as a social security number, student number. There's information that would make the student's identity easily traceable. You have your GPA, academic performance, attendance reports, educational history log. Something I didn't see a lot when I was researching was the information that kind of goes into that educational history log, as far as if you had a student on an RTI or maybe they had an IEP, that information that they received services would also be on that document, and that's something that you would want to have protected. So rights under FERPA. So the first right is to prevent the disclosure of student data. And that's just the right that FERPA is going to make sure that student record is being kept private and only in the hands and the eyes of the appropriate audience. Two is the access to review all educational files. So students and their parents have full access to those educational files at all times. The only times that they don't are, for example, if your student is over 18, the parent no longer has the full consent to request that information. It then turns over to the student. And then the next is the right to request educational records. So how to get those and how to change them if there needs to be amendments to those. who has access to the educational records. So parents are legal guardians if the student is under 18. The student, if he or she is over the ages or over 18 years of age. Government officials with documentation for cause. So if there's a subpoena, a court ordered document saying why that government official needs to review that information, they can. Staff members working with the students. This includes the support members. So this could be your counselor. It could be your math interventionist, your reading interventionist, anyone that's going to be working with that student and pulling them and giving them instructional value, instructional help has the rights to view that information. Again, your teacher and your administration. So if you're meeting with your admin on a certain student, maybe there's a need, maybe there's a miscommunication, maybe there's a disconnect there, you're able to communicate that with the teacher, with the administration. Why is it important? I mean, why do we learn about FERPA? The intentions of FERPA is to protect all of student collected data. Communication between the federal government and the local school system has been convoluted. Schools aren't fully aware of the rules and regulations that apply to FERPA. I mean, I've heard FERPA, I've heard about FERPA, but I've never heard the concrete details that outline it. There are a plethora of situations where schools are permitted to share collected student data. Such cases are usually addressed as emergency scenarios. So in a lot of my research, I found that if there were a school shooting, or let's say, for example, there was a hurricane and you were trying to get information to police officers to help make sure the safety of everyone is secured, that would be a situation in which FERPA laws allow the sharing of that information. Another reason we're learning about this is ransomware is on the rise. As of September 2019, there have been at least 10 schools targeted. I know here in the Pueblo area, I've heard of the steel mill, I've heard of insurance companies, all having that same ransomware situation where someone hacks their system, takes their data, and then holds that data for ransom, saying if you don't, if you're not willing to pay us, we will share this data. In the case of the school, that's very serious ordeal, because that is violating FERPA at its fullest extent, and something that schools cannot let happen. So changing laws to help with FERPA. There are 120 laws in over 40 states that have established laws regarding student privacy since 2013. 8 ways schools can show FERPA compliance. Number 1 is to raise awareness. Talk about how you can be compliant with FERPA, why we should be compliant with FERPA, ways that you can be, ways that you can't be. Confirm that FERPA applies to you and how. For most of us, we receive federal information or federal funding, so FERPA applies to us. Any school, any institution that does receive federal funding must apply, or those FERPA rules and regulations are applied. Know the rights, protections, and exceptions. Again, FERPA is gigantic. There's so much information. You really kind of have to dive in and learn about those rights, protections, and exceptions. Choose compliant vendors. In a COVID era, in a time when we're using technology to its fullest extent, we really have to break down vendors and see what their policies are, see how they share student data. A lot of the information that I got while researching focused on free apps and how the schools are not paying them to use their app, but there are third parties who are paying them to data mine that student information and share it. Next is to train school employees and staff, implement compliant policy and procedures, encrypt files and emails, implement other prevention tools. So FERPA school-wide. So this is kind of bringing it out, looking at it as a whole picture. Just a couple of scenarios that I've come into contact with in my years as teaching. So the first one is when a student is transferred to another school, there must be a transmission of student shared information. So that educational file is being shared from one institution to another. Schools must share that information. So it is a given that when a student enrolls, that there's information that should be going along that educational file. And in my cases, in the times I've seen it, In order to share that information, there must be enrollment confirmation. So before SCA could share that information with another school, they have to have valid information that that student or students have enrolled in another school or school district. Another scenario that we talk about a lot is the video surveillance and how it plays an important role in looking at FERPA. More and more times, or schools are including video in their classrooms, in their hallways. So it plays an important role. When students are videotaped, that tape may be used as evidence in needed circumstances. Let's say there was a fight in the hallway. That videotape can be used, but before those tapes can be reviewed, they must be doctored, if possible, to remove unnecessary student involvement. So for example, if two students were fighting and another student walked down the hallway at the same time, that student walking down the hallway is not directly associated with the situation. So they are, under FERPA laws, not allowed to show that video to anyone else until having that taken off or blurred out. Next one, FERPA at SCA. Thorough vetting of online vendors. Vendors need to be screened for compliance, and vendors often appear to be free, but they're paid by third-party investors in return for student-collected data. Something I kind of highlighted on just a little bit ago. But as we worked through COVID and we were trying to invent new ways to teach and use different apps, we were pulling a lot of resources, and we probably weren't doing the best job at vetting those online vendors and really knowing how to vet those online vendors. How we can help it at SCA is to really look at our school policy and our procedures, really hammer out what can we use, what should we be using, what should we avoid. Installing that policy and procedures in the handbook. And then an overview on staff of questionnaires and surveys, common language, common expectations. I know my classroom uses a lot of Google Forms. I don't require the students to fill out any information, but anytime students are online and doing that, they're sharing information. Maybe they have to put their name or maybe their student number. They're sharing that information online, which can be collected and used as FERPA infringement. How does that look in the classroom? So your grade books, keeping that in a nice, safe place where it's not just out in the open for people to see. Anytime there's video or images of students, making sure they're used appropriately according to school guidelines and such. Assignments, anytime you're having students write that information out. Forms and surveys, making sure that the information you're collecting from students are kept in a safe location. And then again, technology incorporation in lessons. If you're going to use a technology, we need to figure out what student data is being collected from it. Rosenberg does a great job of kind of giving some tips for the classroom. So it really focuses on the filtering of all all technology and apps in the classroom to keep all of the student data in safe places and transitions, and then respond to access requests appropriately. So anytime parents, students are requesting that information of their educational logs, making sure you get that to them. Next up, law enforcement's role of FERPA. So in many cases, law enforcement may only receive educational records through the use of a subpoena. In cases of emergency situations, schools do have the flexibility to share that information with law enforcement. And ICE must obtain legal documentation before receiving student educational files. This becomes tricky due to the laws that don't require students to provide any type of social security or proof of citizenship. What this is focusing on is if you have a student that, let's say, parents migrated from another country, you don't just have to hand over that file if someone was going in and trying to, let's say they were trying to investigate them to make sure that they had proper documentation. FERPA protects all that information the school has so that it doesn't have to be shared. This is going to be a quick breakdown of how to use student data, the data life cycle. So we should capture it, organize it, use it, manage it, and then destroy it. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but this is a breakdown of data destruction. So how you can clear data, how to purge data, and then how to destroy data. Accountability. How are we holding schools accountable to this? So the United States Department of Education holds schools accountable for FERPA. FERPA does not give the rights for individuals to sue schools. FERPA does not give individuals the right to file complaint with the U.S. it does give individuals a right to file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Education. The Department of Education's role at this point is to review and investigate. It works with schools and districts to formulate